Chapter 6 in The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet is The Discovery of a Satellite. With that, he turned and hurried through the gate, and the boys hurried along behind. Not for a second could they take their eyes from him, for never in their lives had they seen such a strange little man. It seemed as if he might float away at any moment. Or was it, David wondered, the way the breeze played through his few thin locks and lifted out the funny, long gray gardening coat he had on? Then what a huge, round, pale head he had, and what a very small face, and enormous liquid eyes, and what thin, spindling arms and hands. Now then, he said, darting round to a side door of his house, just slip your beautiful spaceship in here so she'll be snug and safe. This is the cellar where I grow my mushrooms. My family, for as long as I can remember, has earned its living by growing mushrooms for the markets, and so I do too. Fortunately, there is a very obliging man down the street who takes me in his car to market 3 times a week with my boxes. So the spaceship was rolled into the darkness. There, the boys caught just a glimpse of innumerable tiny white shapes that spread away and away, a glimmering of hundreds of little bald heads that seemed like miniatures of Mr. Bass's own. Then the door was closed and locked, just as if the cellar contained a treasure, and the boys were led round to the front of the house again and ushered into the living room. Outside the windows, the trees pressed close, and inside a wavering sea-green light filled the room like water. Maps of the heavens covered the walls, together with 5 or 6 large pictures in color of the planets of our solar system. They were paintings, but they were so real that you would have thought someone with a camera stood on the very surface of those distant worlds and took color photographs. There were the rings of Saturn, as though you had stood on Saturn itself and looked up into the sky. There were Martian landscapes, and a terrible picture of Mercury all baked and cracked with heat. There were 2 awesome pictures, one of Mars, an enormous pinkish orb webbed over with its green canals hanging in the black sky above Deimos, its satellite. The other was of a huge yellow Saturn, belted with darkness, the shadow of its rings, seen from the surface of its rocky little satellite Mimas. The boys stared at the pictures in silence. Then David turned to Mr. Bass, who was watching them with the greatest enjoyment. "Did you paint all these, Mr. Bass?" "Oh, yes," said Mr. Bass lightly, as though it were nothing at all. "It's a little hobby of mine, to paint what I can imagine of the planets, according to my observations and my mathematical calculations. But now," said Mr. Bass, settling himself in an enormous chair that made him look smaller than ever, and waving the 2 boys to a low couch, "now, at last, I will tell you what has been on my mind." The boys sat down, scarcely able to believe that the great moment had finally arrived. Indeed, they could scarcely believe in Mr. Bass, and David kept wanting to reach out a finger and touch the little man, but of course he did not. "First," said Mr. Bass solemnly, "I want you to know why I put that notice in the paper. You see, it has always seemed to me that I am so different from other earth dwellers that I must be of another kind of life entirely. Not just of another race, you understand, but of another kind. Doesn't it seem to you, Chuck and David, that I am somehow very different from other human beings?" "Oh, yes, Mr. Bass," agreed Chuck and David so heartily that their faces turned quite red with embarrassment. However, their vigor didn't seem to bother Mr. Bass in the least. He chuckled and nodded. "Absolutely different," he agreed. "What is more, all my people have been different, and they've always kept to themselves, with their own customs and stories handed down from father to son. Well, so you see, this set me to wondering if we, my people and I, might perhaps be of another planet altogether." Chuck and David gasped. "Yes, it seemed to me that might be very possible. But of what planet?" I asked myself. Surely it would have to be a satellite of Earth's, and what is more, a satellite not too far off on which a race of people had developed. A race somewhat like Earth people. And of course, Of course, and yet different. Different, you see, as I am different. He paused and gazed at the boys, and then held out his incredibly long, thin fingers, which looked positively greenish in the soft swimming light. "But Mr. Bass," exclaimed Chuck, "how could some of your kind of life get here?" "Why, in the shape of a spore, I should imagine," replied Mr. Bass lightly. "So our strain of life must have begun, carried here in some mysterious fashion across those intervening thousands of miles from that other planet. The chance is 1 in billions, and yet there have been such exceedingly rare occurrences. You notice I said in the shape of a spore. I might have said seed, but in our case, being basidiumites or mushroom people, I have to say spore, because you see, my people develop as mushrooms do." "Well," went on Mr. Bass, "supposing then that there is such a satellite, why, I asked myself, has it never been discovered? There seemed to be no answer to this question, unless," and here Mr. Bass's eyes narrowed, and shrewdly, and he leaned close and held up one spidery finger, "unless," he breathed, speaking very slowly, "this little satellite is invisible to astronomers who persist in searching the skies with their ordinary telescopes." The boys stared at him, scarcely breathing. "The kind that, no matter how big and powerful they are," broke in David, bursting with excitement, "still can't find your satellite." "Precisely," beamed Mr. Bass. "Therefore, there was only one thing for me to do. I had to invent a filter to go over the eyepiece of my telescope, which would enable me to see light rays in a way that they've never been seen before. I knew that first of all, I would have to make a complete study of light, which I did. Then it came to me one night that perhaps the polarization of light, in combination with some sort of stroboscopic mechanism, might possibly do the trick. "Well," said little Mr. Bass, "in the first place I had to discover whether I must use plane polarization, elliptical polarization, or circular polarization, or perhaps some unheard of arrangement of all three. And secondly, this particular filter had to be combined in a certain way with my stroboscopic mechanism, which I assure you is such a mechanism as has never before been seen on Earth." "What's a stroboscopic mechanism, Mr. Bass?" asked Chuck intently. "A stroboscope, Chuck, is an instrument that interrupts light periodically, but that in my case is putting it far too simply, for I had to create new substances to take care of the special purpose I had in mind, some which I think I can truthfully say have never been guessed at in the study of light." "But what are they, Mr. Bass? And did you have to use all three polarizations, or only one? And which one?" "Ha," said little Mr. Bass, his eyes twinkling. Well, that is all very difficult, very complicated, you know." "Very secret, I think he means," David said to himself. "At any rate, days passed, and nights," went on Mr. Bass, "for I was so impatient at feeling myself on the brink of discovering my ancient homeland that I scarcely stopped for food or sleep. One small problem, which I had thought would be the least troublesome, proved to be really staggering. But at last I hit on the answer that I had known almost instinctively would be there, because it had to be there. Into my metal holder I slipped the polarized filter and attached the stroboscopic mechanism, on which I had to make many, many fine adjustments. Now this metal holder was fitted over the eyepiece of the telescope, and the switch controlling the mechanism was plugged in. Slowly I searched the heavens, and then I knew that the moment for which I had waited and worked so long had finally arrived." At the memory, little Mr. Bass seemed quite overcome. For a second or two he could not speak. "My dear friends," he said, his eyes shining, "I cannot tell you all I saw that night. Venus, for instance, appeared in an entirely different aspect, for, you understand, my filter enabled me to see it as no other astronomer has ever done. But I was not after Venus, no. Patiently I moved on, until one morning, very clearly, I came upon my little satellite. Yes, there it was, only 50,000 miles out from our Earth, roughly a fifth as far away as the moon, in a position in space that all astronomers would swear was empty. And upon beholding it, so tiny, so beautiful, I shall not attempt to describe it to you now. I named it Basidium X. Basidium, because I am certain it is peopled with mushroom folk like myself, and X, because it is still unknown. Unknown, that is. And now Mr. Bass smiled a radiant smile, except to ourselves, Tycho Bass, David Topman, and Chuck Masterson. David and Chuck stared at Mr. Bass in stunned silence. Then at last, David managed to speak. Mr. Bass, do you suppose we could, that is, will there ever be any chance of our taking a look at Basidium? Oh, cried Mr. Bass, I should say there will be. Indeed, it is high time for me to show you my own small private observatory. His own small private observatory, one wonder, marveled David to himself, was being piled upon another.